Captain Maria Santos had always been smaller than everyone else around her, but she had never let that stop her from dreaming big. Standing just 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a fighter pilot. When she walked through the halls of Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, senior officers would often mistake her for someone's daughter visiting for the day. The assumption that she couldn't possibly be one of their elite pilots became a constant source of frustration, but also motivation. Maria grew up in a small town in Texas where her father ran a crop dusting business. From the age of 6, she would sit in the cockpit of his old Cessna, watching him work the controls with practiced ease. Her father, Roberto Santos, had served as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam and understood the calling that his daughter felt toward aviation. While other girls her age played with dolls, Maria built model airplanes and studied flight manuals. Her bedroom walls were covered with pictures of fighter jets and aerial combat scenes from World War II. The path to becoming a fighter pilot was never easy for anyone, but for Maria, it meant overcoming doubts that went far beyond the normal challenges of flight training. When she first applied to the Air Force Academy, her high school guidance counselor tried to steer her toward more suitable careers like nursing or teaching. The recruiter at the local Air Force office looked skeptical when she expressed interest in flying fighters rather than transport aircraft or tankers. Even her own mother worried that her daughter was setting herself up for disappointment in a field dominated by men who were typically much larger and stronger. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Maria quickly learned that academic excellence and physical fitness scores meant little when it came to changing perceptions. She graduated 3rd in her class and could run a 6-minute mile, but instructors still questioned whether she had the physical strength to handle a high-performance fighter aircraft under combat stress. The G-forces experienced during air combat maneuvering could reach 9 times the force of gravity, and many believed that someone of Maria's slight build simply couldn't withstand that kind of punishment while maintaining the mental clarity needed for split-second combat decisions. Flight training began at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi, where Maria first climbed into the cockpit of a T-6 Texan trainer aircraft. The instructor pilot, Major Williams, was a veteran fighter pilot who had flown combat missions over Iraq. He made no effort to hide his skepticism about training female pilots for combat roles. During their first flight together, he pushed the aircraft through aggressive maneuvers designed to test Maria's tolerance for G-forces and her ability to maintain aircraft control under stress. Maria not only handled every challenge that Major Williams threw at her, but she began demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his moves and counter them during training dogfights. Her small size, which everyone saw as a weakness, actually gave her some unexpected advantages. She could tolerate higher G-forces than larger pilots because her heart didn't have to work as hard to pump blood to her brain. Her compact frame meant she could fit more comfortably in the cramped cockpit of modern fighter aircraft, and her lower body weight meant the aircraft could carry more fuel or weapons. More importantly, Maria possessed something that couldn't be taught or measured in any standardized test. She had an intuitive understanding of 3-dimensional movement and energy management that veteran pilots recognized as the mark of a natural-born fighter pilot. When she flew, the aircraft seemed to become an extension of her own body rather than a separate machine that she controlled. Other student pilots struggled with the complex calculations needed to intercept a moving target, while both aircraft maneuvered at high speed, but Maria made these judgments instinctively. Despite her obvious talents, the institutional bias against female fighter pilots meant that Maria faced constant scrutiny that her male classmates never experienced. Every mistake was magnified, and every success was attributed to luck rather than skill. When she outperformed other students in air-to-air combat training, instructors suggested that her opponents must have been having an off day. When she demonstrated exceptional accuracy in air-to-ground weapons delivery, they credited the targeting systems rather than her flying ability. The psychological pressure of constantly having to prove herself began to wear on Maria during her second year of training. She started having trouble sleeping and found herself second-guessing decisions that she would normally make instinctively. Her performance scores, while still well above average, began to slip slightly. Some instructors saw this as confirmation of their belief that women lacked the mental toughness needed for combat flying. It was during this difficult period that Maria met Colonel Patricia Hayes, one of the first women to fly fighters for the Air Force. Colonel Hayes had fought many of the same battles that Maria was facing, and she recognized the signs of a promising pilot who was being undermined by institutional prejudice rather than any lack of ability. Hayes began working with Maria as an informal mentor, helping her develop strategies for dealing with the constant pressure to prove herself while maintaining focus on becoming the best pilot she could be. Colonel Hayes shared stories from her own career, including the time when she had been the only woman in her fighter squadron and how she had dealt with skeptical squadron mates who expected her to fail. She explained that every female fighter pilot faced a choice between letting the criticism destroy their confidence or using it as fuel to become better than anyone expected. Hayes also taught Maria practical techniques for managing stress and maintaining situational awareness during high-pressure situations. Under Colonel Hayes's guidance, Maria's performance began to improve dramatically. She started viewing each training mission not as a test that she might fail, but as an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that would eventually silence her critics. Instead of trying to fly like the men in her class, she began developing her own style that took advantage of her unique strengths. Her small size allowed her to make tighter turns without blacking out, and her quick reflexes let her react to threats faster than larger pilots, who needed more time to move their controls. As Maria progressed through advanced fighter training, she began flying the F-16 Fighting Falcon, one of the most capable fighter aircraft in the world. The F-16 was designed to be an air superiority fighter that could outmaneuver anything else in the sky, and it required a pilot with exceptional skills to unlock its full potential. The aircraft's fly-by-wire flight controls and powerful engine made it unforgiving of mistakes, but incredibly capable in the hands of a skilled pilot. Maria's first solo flight in the F-16 was a revelation. The aircraft responded to her inputs with a precision and agility that she had never experienced in training aircraft. When she pushed the throttle forward, the jet's engine provided 30,000 pounds of thrust that pressed her back into her ejection seat with authority. When she pulled the control stick, the aircraft responded instantly with G-forces that would have overwhelmed a less prepared pilot. During air combat maneuvering training, Maria began consistently outflying instructor pilots who had years of experience in the F-16. Her ability to maintain consciousness and control while pulling 9 Gs allowed her to sustain aggressive maneuvers longer than opponents who were forced to ease off the pressure to avoid blacking out. Her understanding of energy management meant that she rarely found herself in a disadvantaged position, and when she did, she could usually reverse the situation through superior flying technique. Word of Maria's exceptional performance began spreading through the fighter pilot community, but rather than gaining respect, she found herself facing even more scrutiny. Senior officers worried that her success was somehow unfair or that she was being graded on a curve because of her gender. Some suggested that male pilots were not flying aggressively against her because they didn't want to hurt a woman, even though every training mission was monitored by experienced instructor pilots who would immediately identify any such behavior. The pressure reached a breaking point during a large-scale training exercise where Maria was assigned to fly as part of a 4-ship formation tasked with air superiority missions. The formation leader was Captain Johnson, a pilot with several years of F-16 experience who had made it clear that he didn't believe women belonged in fighter cockpits. During the mission briefing, Johnson assigned Maria to a supporting role that would keep her away from the primary air-to-air engagements. Maria knew that this was another test disguised as a routine training mission. If she performed her assigned role without complaint, it would be seen as evidence that she couldn't handle the pressure of air combat. If she questioned the mission assignment, it would be characterized as insubordination or evidence that she couldn't work as part of a team. She decided to fly the mission exactly as briefed while looking for opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities within the constraints of her assigned role. During the exercise, Johnson's formation encountered a group of aggressor aircraft playing the role of enemy fighters. The engagement quickly became chaotic as multiple aircraft maneuvered for advantage in three-dimensional space. Johnson found himself overwhelmed by two aggressor aircraft and called for assistance, but the other pilots in the formation were dealing with their own threats. Maria was positioned several miles away when she heard Johnson's distress call. According to her assigned role, she was supposed to maintain her position and avoid engaging enemy aircraft unless directly threatened. However, her training and instincts told her that Johnson was in serious trouble and needed immediate assistance. She made the decision to abandon her assigned position and race toward the engagement at maximum speed. What happened next would be discussed in fighter pilot bars for years afterward. Maria arrived at the engagement area just as Johnson was about to be defeated by the two aggressor aircraft. Instead of joining the turning fight and getting drawn into the same trap that had caught Johnson, Maria used her altitude advantage to dive down on one of the aggressors from above. Her attack was perfectly timed and executed, eliminating one threat before the pilot even knew she was there. The second aggressor pilot tried to escape the area, but Maria had positioned herself perfectly to cut off his escape route. She maneuvered her F-16 with such precision that the aggressor pilot found himself trapped between Maria and the terrain below. Faced with no good options, he was forced to concede defeat and declare himself shot down. Johnson's reaction to being rescued by the pilot he had tried to sideline was complicated. He was grateful to be alive, but frustrated that his own performance had been shown up by someone he considered unqualified for combat flying. During the debrief after the mission, he tried to minimize Maria's contribution by suggesting that she had simply gotten lucky with her positioning. However, the mission video clearly showed that her attack had been planned and executed with the skill of a veteran combat pilot. The training exercise became a turning point in Maria's career, but not in the way she had hoped. Instead of finally gaining acceptance from her peers, she found herself facing accusations that she was a show-off who took unnecessary risks. Some instructors suggested that her decision to abandon her assigned position showed poor judgment and an inability to follow orders. Others worried that her success would give other female pilots unrealistic expectations about their own capabilities. Maria realized that no amount of flying skill would be enough to change the minds of those who were determined to see her fail. She would need to prove herself in actual combat, where results mattered more than politics or prejudice. The opportunity to do so came sooner than anyone expected, when international tensions began escalating in a region where the United States had significant strategic interests. Intelligence reports indicated that a hostile nation was building up its air force with advanced fighter aircraft and was making increasingly aggressive moves against neighboring allies. The situation was becoming unstable enough that military planners began preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. Fighter squadrons across the Air Force were placed on alert and began intensive training for possible deployment to the region. Maria's squadron was among those selected for potential deployment, but her participation was far from guaranteed. Squadron commanders worried about the political implications of sending female pilots into combat, especially if casualties occurred. There were concerns about how the enemy would treat captured female pilots and whether the presence of women in the squadron would create distractions for male pilots. Despite these concerns, Maria's flying skills had become impossible to ignore. She had consistently outperformed every other pilot in the squadron during training exercises, and her aircraft was always perfectly maintained and ready for missions. When the deployment order finally came down, her squadron commander decided that he couldn't afford to leave his best pilot behind, regardless of her gender. The deployment to the forward operating base took place under strict operational security. Fighter aircraft and support equipment were moved to the region over several weeks through a carefully orchestrated logistics operation. Pilots were briefed on the political situation and the rules of engagement that would govern any potential combat operations. They were told to expect that any conflict would likely be intense but brief, as both sides had strong incentives to avoid a prolonged war. Maria found herself assigned to a squadron that was tasked with air superiority missions, which meant that her primary job would be to shoot down enemy aircraft and protect friendly forces from air attack. This was exactly the type of mission she had trained for throughout her career, but she knew that her every action would be scrutinized by commanders who were still skeptical about female combat pilots. As tensions continued to escalate, both sides began flying increasingly aggressive patrol missions along disputed borders. Fighter aircraft from both nations would approach each other at high speed, testing response times and trying to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities. These encounters rarely resulted in actual combat, but they served as a way for both sides to demonstrate their resolve while stopping just short of open warfare. During one of these patrol missions, Maria got her first close look at the enemy aircraft that she might soon be fighting. The opposing fighters were modern, well-equipped aircraft flown by pilots who appeared to be skilled and aggressive. She realized that any combat would be between roughly equal forces, where superior training and tactics would likely determine the outcome. The final diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis were failing, and military commanders on both sides were making preparations for what seemed to be inevitable conflict. Fighter pilots spent their days studying intelligence reports about enemy aircraft and tactics while maintaining their aircraft in peak condition for combat operations. Everyone knew that when the shooting started, there would be little time for second chances or learning from mistakes. The alert klaxon pierced the pre-dawn darkness at exactly 0430 hours, jolting Maria Santos from the light sleep that fighter pilots learned to take whenever possible during times of high tension. She had been deployed to the forward operating base for 3 weeks now, flying patrol missions along the disputed border, while diplomats made their final attempts to prevent what everyone could see coming. The sound of that klaxon meant that diplomacy had finally failed, and real combat was about to begin. Maria rolled out of her bunk and began the practiced routine that she had rehearsed countless times during training exercises. Flight suit, survival vest, helmet bag, and a quick check of her personal equipment. Around her, the other pilots in her squadron were going through the same ritual, but she could sense the tension that came with knowing this would not be another training mission. Today, people would likely die, and there was no guarantee that any of them would be coming back to this tent tonight. The briefing room was packed with pilots, weapons officers, intelligence personnel, and commanders who had been working through the night to plan the day's missions. The large screen at the front of the room displayed a map of the region with various symbols indicating friendly and enemy positions. Red arrows showed the direction of enemy ground forces that had begun crossing the border at multiple points, supported by fighter aircraft that were already engaging patrol missions from allied nations. Colonel Matthews, the wing commander, stood before the assembled air crew with the grim expression of someone who had been through combat before and understood what they were about to face. He had flown fighters during the Gulf War and knew that air combat was a violent, unforgiving business where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. His job was to make sure that his pilots understood both the mission and the stakes involved in its execution. "Ladies and gentlemen, the balloon has gone up," Colonel Matthews began, using the military term for the start of hostilities. At 0300 hours, enemy ground forces began a coordinated invasion across our allies' border. Their air force is providing close air support to their ground troops and flying combat air patrol missions to protect their advance. Our job is to stop them. The intelligence officer took over the briefing, displaying reconnaissance photos that showed enemy aircraft on various airfields throughout the region. The photos revealed modern fighter aircraft that appeared to be well-maintained and ready for combat operations. Intelligence estimates suggested that the enemy Air Force had approximately 150 fighter aircraft available, flown by pilots who had received training from experienced instructors and had been preparing for this conflict for several months. Maria studied the intelligence photographs carefully, noting the types of aircraft that she would likely be fighting and trying to assess their capabilities compared to her own F-16. The enemy fighters appeared to be a mix of older aircraft that had been upgraded with modern systems and some newer designs that could pose a serious threat to American aircraft. She made mental notes about the weapons systems that each type carried and began thinking about tactics that might give her an advantage in combat. The mission for Maria's four-ship formation was straightforward, but dangerous. They would fly combat air patrol over a critical supply route that enemy aircraft were attempting to cut with bombing attacks. Their job was to shoot down any enemy fighters that entered their assigned area and protect the ground forces below from air attack. It was exactly the type of mission that fighter pilots trained for their entire careers, but also one that carried the highest risk of casualties. Captain Johnson, who would be leading the formation, had requested that Maria be assigned to a different mission, arguing that this particular patrol would be too dangerous for someone with no combat experience. However, Colonel Matthews had overruled that request, pointing out that Maria was one of his most skilled pilots and that he needed his best people flying the most critical missions. Johnson's objections had more to do with his personal opinions about female combat pilots than with any realistic assessment of Maria's capabilities. As the briefing continued, Maria learned that enemy aircraft had already shot down 2 Allied fighters during the early morning hours, killing both pilots. The enemy pilots appeared to be well-trained and aggressive, willing to take significant risks to complete their missions. Intelligence reports suggested that they were using sophisticated tactics and were being supported by an effective command and control system that could coordinate multiple aircraft in complex operations. The weather forecast called for clear skies with good visibility, which would favor the side with better-trained pilots and superior situational awareness. Maria felt confident in her training and her aircraft, but she also understood that combat was inherently unpredictable. Even the best pilots could be shot down by a lucky shot or a moment of inattention. She focused on reviewing her emergency procedures and making sure that she understood the locations of all friendly forces in the area. After the main briefing, the 4 pilots who would fly together met separately to discuss their specific tactics and procedures. Johnson, as the flight leader, would be responsible for coordinating their movements and making tactical decisions during combat. The other 2 pilots in the formation were Captain Martinez and Lieutenant Thompson, both experienced F-16 pilots who had flown with Johnson before. Maria was the newest member of the team, and she could sense some reluctance from the others to fully accept her as an equal partner in the mission. Johnson's flight briefing focused heavily on maintaining formation discipline and following his lead during any combat encounters. He made it clear that he expected the other pilots to stick to their assigned positions and avoid taking independent action unless specifically directed otherwise. Maria understood that this was partially directed at her, as Johnson still believed that she was more likely than the others to make poor decisions under the stress of combat. The pilots spent an additional hour reviewing emergency procedures, studying the locations of search and rescue assets, and memorizing the radio frequencies that they would need if shot down behind enemy lines. They discussed the code words that would be used to indicate various types of threats and reviewed the rules of engagement that would govern their actions during combat. Everyone understood that any mistakes could result in friendly fire incidents or violations of international law. As they prepared to leave for the flight line, Colonel Matthews pulled Maria aside for a brief private conversation. He had been watching the dynamics within the squadron and understood the additional pressure that she was facing as the only female combat pilot in the unit. Matthews had served with distinction during multiple combat deployments and had learned to judge pilots based on their skills rather than their demographics. "Santos, I want you to know that you're here because you're one of the best pilots I have," Matthews told her quietly. "I don't give a damn what anyone else thinks about female pilots. When the shooting starts, I want my best people in the air, and that includes you. Fly your aircraft, trust your training, and don't let anyone else's opinions get in your head." Matthews' words provided exactly the encouragement that Maria needed to hear. She had spent so much of her career dealing with skepticism and prejudice that it was easy to forget that some commanders really did evaluate pilots based solely on their abilities. She thanked the colonel and headed toward the flight line with renewed confidence in her mission and her place in the squadron. The F-16 Fighting Falcon that Maria climbed into that morning had been meticulously maintained by the ground crew and was armed with the latest air-to-air missiles and cannon ammunition. The aircraft carried AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles that could engage targets at distances of over 50 miles, as well as AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles for close-range combat. The internal cannon held 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition that could destroy any aircraft with just a few hits. Maria ran through her pre-flight checklist with extra care, knowing that any mechanical problems during combat could be fatal. She tested all of her aircraft systems, verified that her weapons were properly loaded and armed, and confirmed that her electronic countermeasures were functioning correctly. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, gave her a thumbs-up signal indicating that the aircraft was ready for combat operations. The 4 F-16s taxied out to the runway in formation, with Johnson leading and Maria flying in the number 4 position. As they waited for clearance to take off, Maria could hear radio chatter from other missions that were already airborne and engaging enemy aircraft. The reports were terse and professional, but she could detect the tension in the pilots' voices as they maneuvered against hostile fighters that were trying to kill them. Tower control cleared the flight for takeoff, and the 4 F-16s roared down the runway in sequence, their afterburners leaving trails of flame in the morning air. Maria felt the familiar sensation of acceleration as her aircraft lifted off and began climbing toward their assigned patrol altitude. Within minutes, they were airborne and heading toward what would likely be their first combat engagement. The flight to their patrol area took 20 minutes, during which time they received regular updates from the Airborne Command and Control aircraft that was coordinating all friendly air operations in the region. Enemy aircraft were active throughout the operational area, and several engagements were already in progress. 2 more Allied aircraft had been shot down, but enemy losses were mounting as well, with at least 4 confirmed kills by friendly fighters. As they approached their assigned patrol area, the air battle manager aboard the command aircraft began vectoring them toward a group of enemy fighters that was approaching the supply route they were supposed to protect. The initial report indicated 4 enemy aircraft flying in formation at medium altitude, apparently preparing to attack ground targets with precision-guided munitions. Johnson's flight would have to intercept them before they could complete their attack mission. Maria's heart rate increased as she realized that combat was now imminent. She checked her weapon systems one final time and made sure that her radar was properly configured for air-to-air engagement. The enemy aircraft were still 40 miles away, but they were approaching rapidly, and the 2 formations would merge within the next few minutes. She forced herself to remain calm and focus on the tactical situation rather than dwelling on the fact that people were about to try to kill her. Johnson's voice came over the radio with the tactical instructions that would govern their engagement. He planned to attack the enemy formation from slightly above and to the side, using their superior position to gain an advantage before the enemy pilots realized they were under attack. The 4 F-16s would fire their long-range missiles simultaneously, hoping to destroy all 4 enemy aircraft before they could react effectively. The plan was sound in theory, But Maria recognized that enemy pilots would not simply fly straight and level while being attacked. The moment they detected incoming missiles, they would begin evasive maneuvers and would likely launch their own weapons in response. The engagement was about to become a chaotic multi-aircraft dogfight where superior flying skills and situational awareness would determine the survivors. At 30 miles range, Johnson gave the order to lock onto the enemy aircraft with their radar systems. Maria selected the leftmost enemy fighter and waited for her fire control system to indicate that she had a good missile shot. The AIM-120 missile she was preparing to launch was one of the most advanced air-to-air weapons in the world. But it still required proper setup and timing to be effective against a maneuvering target. "Rifles, rifles!" Johnson called out as he launched the first missile, using the standard radio call to indicate that advanced medium-range missiles were in the air. The other 3 pilots followed immediately, sending 4 deadly projectiles streaking toward the enemy formation at over 3 times the speed of sound. The missiles would take nearly a minute to reach their targets, during which time the tactical situation could change dramatically. The enemy formation reacted exactly as Maria had predicted. The moment their radar warning systems detected the incoming missiles, the 4 aircraft broke formation and began aggressive evasive maneuvers. 2 of the enemy pilots immediately turned toward Johnson's flight and began launching their own missiles, transforming what had been a long-range engagement into a close-range dogfight where both sides were in mortal danger. Johnson called for his flight to defend against the incoming enemy missiles by turning away and dispensing chaff and flares to confuse their guidance systems. Maria followed the tactical instruction while keeping track of the overall engagement through her radar display and radio communications. She watched as one of their missiles found its target and destroyed an enemy fighter in a brilliant explosion. But the other 3 enemy aircraft were still maneuvering aggressively and had become a serious threat. The engagement quickly devolved into exactly the type of chaotic, close-range combat that fighter pilots called a furball. Aircraft were maneuvering at high speed in all 3 dimensions, with pilots pulling heavy G-forces while trying to position their aircraft for killing shots. Radio discipline began to break down, as pilots called out threats and maneuvered to avoid collisions with both enemy and friendly aircraft. Maria found herself separated from the other members of her flight as the combat area expanded and aircraft spread out across several miles of airspace. Her training had prepared her for this possibility, and she continued to maneuver aggressively while trying to re-establish contact with Johnson's aircraft. She could see an enemy fighter approximately 2 miles away that appeared to be setting up for an attack on one of her squadron mates, and she turned toward it while preparing to engage with her short-range missiles. The enemy pilot was skilled and aggressive, pulling his aircraft through a series of high G turns that made it difficult for Maria to achieve a missile lock. She found herself in a classic turning fight, where both aircraft were maneuvering at their performance limits, while each pilot tried to gain a positional advantage that would allow a successful attack. This was exactly the type of combat that Maria had trained for throughout her career, and her small size and high G tolerance were beginning to provide the advantages that she had always believed they would. As the 2 aircraft continued their deadly dance, Maria began to gain a slight edge through superior energy management and tighter turning radius. The enemy pilot was flying a capable aircraft, but he was unable to match the combination of Maria's flying skills and the F-16's exceptional maneuverability. She was gradually moving into a position where she could employ her weapons effectively, but she knew that the enemy pilot would not give up easily and might have surprises of his own. Maria Santos pulled her F-16 through a crushing 8G turn, her vision narrowing to a tunnel as the blood drained from her head, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The enemy pilot she was fighting had just made a critical mistake, turning left when he should have turned right, and now she had the advantage she needed. Her finger moved to the missile launch button as her aircraft's targeting system achieved a solid lock on the enemy fighter. "Fox 2!" she called out over the radio, using the standard call for a heat-seeking missile launch. The AM-9 Sidewinder leaped off her wing rail and streaked toward the enemy aircraft at twice the speed of sound. The enemy pilot saw it coming and tried to turn away while dispensing flares, but he was too late and had no energy left for effective evasive maneuvers. The missile impacted his aircraft just behind the cockpit, and the fighter disappeared in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. That was her first kill, but there was no time to celebrate. Her radar warning receiver was screaming at her, indicating that another enemy aircraft had locked onto her from somewhere behind and to her right. Maria immediately broke hard left and began dispensing chaff and flares while scanning the sky for the threat. She spotted the enemy fighter approximately 3 miles away and climbing toward her position with obvious aggressive intent. This new opponent was flying a more advanced aircraft than the first one, and Maria could see additional missiles hanging from its wing pylons. The pilot also appeared to be more skilled, maintaining proper energy management as he maneuvered to attack her. Maria realized that this engagement would be more challenging than her first, but she felt the familiar calm focus that came over her during high-stress situations. The two aircraft began another turning fight, but this time Maria found herself starting from a disadvantaged position. The enemy pilot had altitude and energy advantages that he was using skillfully to maintain offensive pressure while avoiding Maria's attempts to counterattack. She was forced to defend aggressively, pulling maximum G-forces just to avoid giving him a clear missile shot. Maria's smaller size and exceptional G-tolerance were keeping her alive, but she needed to find a way to reverse the tactical situation before the enemy pilot wore her down or made a lucky shot. She began using a technique that her instructors had called the vertical game, trading airspeed for altitude in a series of climbing and diving maneuvers that gradually evened out the energy balance between the two aircraft. After 3 minutes of intense maneuvering, Maria saw her opening. The enemy pilot had become focused on achieving a perfect missile shot and had allowed his airspeed to decay too much. When he tried to pull his nose up for another attack, his aircraft couldn't respond quickly enough, and Maria was able to reverse into an offensive position. Her training and instincts took over as she smoothly transitioned from defense to attack. "Fox 2!" she called again, as her second Sidewinder missile left the rail. This time, the enemy pilot had even less time to react, and the missile struck his aircraft in the engine compartment. The fighter began spinning toward the ground in flames, and Maria saw the pilot's ejection seat fire just before the aircraft exploded. Her second kill had taken less than 4 minutes from initial contact. As Maria climbed back to altitude and began searching for other threats, she heard Johnson's voice over the radio calling for assistance. His aircraft had been damaged by an enemy missile and he was having difficulty controlling it. 2 enemy fighters were pursuing him and appeared to be setting up for another attack that would likely finish him off. Johnson was calling for any available friendly aircraft to help him, but the rest of the flight was engaged with other threats. Maria looked at her fuel and weapons status and realized that she was in good shape to continue fighting. She had burned more fuel than planned during her first 2 engagements, but she still had enough for another 15 minutes of combat maneuvering. More importantly, she still carried 2 AIM-120 medium-range missiles and a full load of cannon ammunition. She turned toward Johnson's position and pushed her throttle into afterburner. The 2 enemy fighters pursuing Johnson were so focused on finishing off the damaged F-16 that they didn't notice Maria approaching from the side until it was too late. She achieved radar locks on both aircraft simultaneously and launched both of her remaining AIM-120 missiles in rapid succession. The enemy pilots suddenly found themselves defending against incoming missiles while trying to maintain their attack on Johnson, and the multitasking proved too much for them to handle effectively. Both missiles found their targets within seconds of each other, destroying the 2 enemy fighters in spectacular explosions that lit up the afternoon sky. Maria's third and fourth kills had been achieved with textbook precision, demonstrating the importance of situational awareness and energy management in beyond visual range combat. Johnson was able to escape the engagement and began limping back toward base with his damaged aircraft. "Good shooting, Santos," Johnson called over the radio, and Maria could hear genuine respect in his voice for the first time since she had joined the squadron. He had just been saved by the pilot he had tried to keep out of combat, and the irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. Johnson's aircraft was trailing smoke and losing hydraulic fluid, but he appeared to have enough control to make it back to base safely. Maria began climbing back to altitude while scanning for additional threats. The air battle was still raging across a large area, with multiple engagements in progress and aircraft from both sides maneuvering for advantage. Her fuel was getting low enough that she would need to head home soon, but she wanted to make sure that the immediate area was clear of enemy aircraft before leaving Johnson to fly alone with his damaged aircraft. That was when she spotted them. A formation of 4 enemy fighters approaching at low altitude, obviously planning to attack the supply convoy that Johnson's flight had been sent to protect. The enemy aircraft were flying nap of the Earth to avoid radar detection, and they would likely succeed in completing their attack mission unless someone stopped them immediately. Maria was the only friendly aircraft in position to intercept them, and she knew that she would have to act quickly. The problem was that she had used up all of her missiles and would have to engage 4 enemy aircraft with only her internal cannon. The 20-millimeter gun was a devastating weapon against aircraft, but it required her to get much closer to the enemy than missiles would allow. She would have to maneuver within a few hundred yards of hostile fighters while they were actively trying to shoot her down with both missiles and their own guns. Maria made the decision that would define her entire career. Instead of retreating to a safe distance and calling for backup that might not arrive in time, she dove toward the enemy formation at maximum speed. Her approach angle and timing were perfect, allowing her to surprise the enemy pilots who were focused on their ground attack mission and not expecting to encounter air-to-air threats at low altitude. She lined up behind the trailing aircraft in the enemy formation and squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of 20-millimeter shells into the fighter's engine compartment. The aircraft exploded immediately, and Maria flew through the debris cloud while maneuvering to attack the next target. Her 5th kill had taken only seconds, but the other 3 enemy pilots were now aware of her presence and were turning to fight. What followed was the most intense 3 minutes of air combat that Maria had ever experienced. At low altitude, aircraft had less room to maneuver, and mistakes were immediately fatal. She found herself in a 4-way dogfight, where everyone was trying to shoot everyone else while avoiding collision with the ground below. Her small size and superior G-tolerance allowed her to outturn the enemy aircraft, but she was outnumbered 3-1 and running low on ammunition. Maria used every technique she had learned during years of training, plus a few that she improvised on the spot. She employed the terrain to mask her movements, used the sun to blind enemy pilots at critical moments, and took advantage of split-second opportunities that larger pilots might have missed. Her situational awareness remained perfect even as the engagement became increasingly chaotic, and she never lost track of where all the other aircraft were positioned. The second enemy fighter fell to her guns after a brief turning fight in which Maria demonstrated her superior energy management skills. She had positioned herself perfectly for a high-deflection shot that required leading the target by exactly the right amount while pulling heavy G-forces. Her 6th kill came as the enemy pilot tried to escape the engagement by diving toward the ground, only to run out of altitude before he could complete his maneuver. 2 enemy aircraft remained, and both pilots were now flying defensively while trying to call for backup on their radio. Maria realized that she was running critically low on cannon ammunition and would need to make every shot count. She also knew that other enemy aircraft would likely arrive soon, and she would be completely helpless once her gun ammunition was exhausted. The penultimate engagement was a classic merge plot where both aircraft approached each other head-on at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles per hour. Maria and the enemy pilot passed within a few hundred feet of each other, then immediately began turning to achieve a firing position. This type of engagement favored the pilot with the tighter turning radius, and Maria's F-16 could outturn almost any other fighter aircraft in the world. She gradually worked her way around to the enemy pilot's 6 o'clock position, while he desperately tried to reverse the engagement or escape to fight another day. When Maria finally achieved a firing solution, she had less than 50 rounds of ammunition remaining. She held her fire until she was absolutely certain of a hit, then squeezed the trigger for a brief burst that destroyed the enemy aircraft's wing and sent it tumbling toward the ground. The final enemy pilot had watched his 3 wingmen get shot down by a single American fighter and was beginning to question the wisdom of continuing the engagement. He was flying the most advanced aircraft of the group and still had all of his missiles, but he had also seen enough to realize that he was fighting someone with exceptional skills. When Maria turned toward him for the final engagement, he made the decision to retreat rather than risk becoming her 7th victim. Maria was down to her last few cannon rounds and would have had difficulty engaging another aircraft even if the pilot had chosen to fight. Her fuel was also critically low, and she needed to head back to base immediately to avoid running out over enemy territory. She watched the last enemy fighter disappear toward his own airspace while she turned toward home, her mission completed successfully. The flight back to base gave Maria time to process what had just happened. In less than 20 minutes of combat, she had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft using a combination of missiles and cannon fire. More importantly, she had saved Johnson's life and prevented the enemy formation from attacking the supply convoy. Her performance had been flawless from both a tactical and technical standpoint. As she approached the airfield, Maria could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway in preparation for Johnson's landing with his damaged aircraft. She was directed to a different runway where she could land normally and taxi back to the squadron area. Her F-16 was completely undamaged, despite having been through 6 separate air combat engagements, a testament to both her flying skills and her understanding of energy management principles. The ground crew that met her aircraft was buzzing with excitement as word of her combat success had already reached the base through radio communications from the airborne command aircraft. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was grinning from ear to ear as he helped her shut down the aircraft and climb out of the cockpit. Other pilots from the squadron were gathering around to hear her account of the mission firsthand. Colonel Matthews was waiting for Maria when she entered the squadron building for her mission debrief. His expression was one of professional satisfaction mixed with genuine pride in one of his pilots. He had been monitoring the radio communications during the mission and understood exactly what Maria had accomplished under the most challenging possible circumstances. "Santos, that was some of the finest flying I've seen in 20 years of fighter operations," Matthews told her. "You saved Johnson's life, protected the convoy, and eliminated 6 enemy aircraft without taking a scratch. That's the kind of performance that wins wars and saves the lives of friendly forces on the ground." The formal debrief took 2 hours, as intelligence officers questioned Maria about every detail of her engagements. They were particularly interested in the capabilities and tactics of the enemy aircraft she had fought, as well as any lessons learned that could be passed on to other pilots. Maria's clear recollection of events and technical understanding of air combat tactics provided valuable information for future missions. Johnson sought out Maria after his own debrief of the mission. His aircraft had been severely damaged, but had held together long enough for him to land safely. The maintenance crew estimated that his F-16 would be out of service for at least a week, while they repaired the damage from the enemy missile hit. He knew that without Maria's intervention, he would almost certainly have been shot down and killed. "I owe you my life," Johnson told her simply. "I was wrong about female pilots, and I was wrong about you specifically. You're the best fighter pilot in this squadron, and I'll make sure that everyone knows it." His apology was genuine and complete, representing a fundamental change in his attitudes that would influence his interactions with future female pilots throughout the rest of his career. News of Maria's combat performance spread rapidly through the fighter pilot community and beyond. 6 kills in a single mission was an exceptional achievement that placed her among the ranks of the most successful fighter pilots in military history. More importantly, her success had come against skilled enemy pilots flying modern aircraft, proving that her abilities were not dependent on facing inferior opponents. The media attention that followed was something that Maria had never wanted or expected. Reporters were eager to tell the story of the female pilot who had been consistently underestimated but had proven her critics wrong in the most definitive way possible. Maria found herself uncomfortable with the publicity, but recognized that her story might inspire other women to pursue careers in aviation and other traditionally male-dominated fields. The psychological impact of Maria's success extended far beyond her own squadron or even her own Air Force. Enemy pilots who had been briefed about her combat record began showing more caution when engaging American fighters, never knowing if they might be facing the legendary pilot who had destroyed 6 aircraft in a single mission. The deterrent effect of her reputation contributed to American air superiority throughout the rest of the conflict. Within her own squadron, Maria's success had transformed the dynamics and eliminated the last vestiges of skepticism about female combat pilots. Her squadron mates now sought out her advice on air combat tactics and treated her as the expert fighter pilot that she had always been. The respect she received was based purely on her demonstrated abilities and had nothing to do with politics or social pressure. Maria continued flying combat missions for the remainder of the deployment, adding 3 more confirmed kills to her record while leading flights of other pilots into combat. Her total of 9 aerial victories made her the highest-scoring American pilot of the conflict and earned her recognition as one of the finest fighter pilots of her generation. More importantly, her success had opened doors for countless other women who would follow in her footsteps. Years later, when Maria retired from active duty as a brigadier general, she would look back on those 20 minutes of combat as the turning point not just in her own career, but in the broader acceptance of women in combat roles throughout the military. Her legacy was not just the aircraft she had shot down, but the barriers she had broken and the opportunities she had created for future generations of female pilots. The small girl from Texas who had dreamed of flying fighters while sitting in her father's crop duster had proven that skill, determination, and courage were not dependent on gender. She had faced down not just enemy aircraft, but institutional prejudice and personal doubt, emerging victorious on all fronts. Her story became an inspiration to anyone who had ever been underestimated because of who they were rather than what they could accomplish. Maria Santos had shown the world that when it truly mattered, when lives were on the line and seconds counted, performance was the only thing that mattered. In 20 minutes of perfect flying, she had silenced every critic and earned a place among the greatest fighter pilots in history. No one would ever underestimate her again.